The concept of the Soviet Union's global influence refers to the extensive political, military, and ideological reach exercised by the USSR from its emergence after World War II until its dissolution in 1991. As the leading force in the Eastern Bloc and a superpower rivaling the United States, the Soviet Union's influence was characterized by its promotion of communism, strategic alliances, and interventions across the globe. This influence was not only pivotal in shaping global geopolitics during the Cold War, but also instrumental in the eventual unraveling of the Soviet Union itself. Understanding this influence is crucial to comprehending why the fall of the Soviet Union marked such a profound shift in international relations. The significance of the Soviet Union's global influence lies in its role as a counterbalance to Western powers. The USSR supported communist movements and regimes worldwide, from Eastern Europe to Cuba, and parts of Africa and Asia, often leading to proxy wars, political tensions, and diplomatic standoffs. For instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 highlighted the profound global stakes involved in Soviet-American relations, where the Soviet decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Another example is the Soviet-Afghan War, where Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979 further inflamed Cold War tensions and drained Soviet resources, contributing to its eventual collapse. Scholars argue that Soviet global influence helped maintain a form of international equilibrium, albeit tense, during the Cold War. The existence of two superpowers forced deliberation and negotiation, creating a certain stability through mutual deterrence. However, critics contend that Soviet influence often resulted in oppressive regimes, human rights abuses, and perpetuated conflicts under the guise of supporting ideological allies. Challenges to understanding this influence include divergent viewpoints on the moral and ethical implications of Soviet actions. Some view Soviet support for developing countries as an anti-imperialist counterbalance to Western colonialism, while others see it as expansionist and coercive. Moreover, the economic burden placed on the Soviet Union to maintain its global commitments is frequently cited as a contributing factor to its internal weaknesses and eventual downfall. The influence of the Soviet Union globally directly connects to its collapse by highlighting the overextension and unsustainable nature of its foreign and domestic policies. The financial strain of maintaining satellite states and military engagements, coupled with internal economic stagnation, set the stage for a transformative shift in global power dynamics as the USSR ceased to exist, fundamentally altering international relations and leading to the unipolar moment dominated by the United States in the post-Cold War era. Economic challenges and stagnation in the 1980s were pivotal in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, representing a period marked by systemic inefficiencies, declining growth rates, and an inability to compete with Western economies. This stagnation is defined by the lack of productivity and innovation, reflecting a decline in the Soviet economy that had repercussions on its global standing and internal stability. The significance of this economic downturn cannot be overstated, as it directly undermined the Soviet Union's superpower status, weakening its global influence and destabilizing the socio-economic fabric of the nation. Two notable examples highlight the economic challenges of this time. First, the inefficiency intrinsic to the centrally planned economy resulted in widespread shortages of consumer goods. Despite being a major global power, everyday essentials like food and clothing were often scarce, causing dissatisfaction among the populace. Second, the arms race with the United States further strained the Soviet economy. Investing heavily in military technology and procurement without the economic backbone to support it led to an unsustainable fiscal policy, diverting resources from crucial domestic needs. Economists and historians frequently cite the Soviet Union's failure to adapt its economic policies as a core reason for its decline. While some Soviet leaders, like Mikhail Gorbachev, recognized the need for reform, initiatives such as Perestroika were introduced too late and were too limited to reverse deep-seated economic problems. Many argue that this stagnation was a critical sign of systemic failure, signaling the inevitable demise of a structure that could not innovate or compete. However, alternative viewpoints suggest that the Soviet Union's economic challenges were exacerbated by external pressures, such as fluctuating oil prices and geopolitical tensions with the West, rather than inherent flaws alone. Critics of Gorbachev's policies also contend that the rapid push for reform without proper groundwork led to chaos rather than recovery, accelerating the Soviet Union's disintegration. The economic stagnation of the 1980s is intricately connected to other aspects of the Soviet collapse. It undermined confidence in the Communist Party and eroded the ideological commitment of the people, contributing to political unrest and the eventual dissolution of the Union. Socially, it fostered a growing disparity in living standards between the Soviet Union and the West, feeding discontent and fueling movements for independence within Soviet republics. Thus, economic stagnation in the 1980s was not just a precursor, but a catalyst in the fall of the Soviet Union, highlighting the essential interconnection between economic viability and political stability in maintaining superpower status. Gorbachev's reforms, Perestroika and Glasnost, were pivotal policies introduced in the mid-1980s by Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to revitalize the Soviet economy by introducing elements of market economics and reducing the state's pervasive control over production. Glasnost, translating to openness, sought to increase transparency in government institutions and allow for greater freedom of expression, a radical shift from previous Soviet policies. These reforms were significant as they marked a decisive step away from the rigid centralization and authoritarianism that characterized the Soviet system. Economically, Perestroika intended to decentralize economic decision-making to improve efficiency and stimulate growth, which was crucial given the stagnation the Soviet economy faced in the 1980s. Politically, Glasnost fostered public discussions about society's problems, encouraged the exposure of government corruption, and emboldened critiques of long-standing issues. A real-world application of Glasnost was witnessed in the loosening of restrictions on the media. This shift allowed for the publication of previously banned literature and more critical journalism, which in turn increased public awareness and dialogue about the country's dire situations. An example of Perestroika involved the Law on State Enterprises, enacted in 1987, which gave factory managers more independence and incentivized productivity, although its outcomes were mixed and often fell short of ambitious goals. Supporters of these reforms, including many Soviet citizens and Western observers, believed they were necessary to modernize Soviet society and make it more competitive on the world stage. They saw Gorbachev as a visionary leader attempting to bring about necessary change. However, these reforms also sparked significant challenges and controversies. Economically, the transition away from a planned economy was tumultuous, leading to shortages and a further decline in living standards. Politically, increased openness led to the rise of nationalist movements and significant unrest among Soviet republics, ultimately contributing to the dissolution of the state. Alternative viewpoints contend that these reforms hastened the Soviet Union's collapse by destabilizing an already fragile system. The weakening of central authority made it difficult to manage dissent and control, influencing the eventual fragmentation of a once cohesive superpower. In influence, Gorbachev's reforms unintentionally accelerated demands for greater autonomy within the various Soviet republics, directly contributing to the broader disintegration and fall of the Soviet Union. These policies, while aiming for renewal, inadvertently undermined the structure of the Soviet Union, leading to its eventual end as a superpower in 1991. The rise of nationalism and independence movements was a pivotal force, leading to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Nationalism, in this context, refers to the identification with and support for the interests and culture of a particular nation, often in opposition to colonial or foreign rule. During the latter half of the 20th century, nationalism surged among the diverse ethnic groups within the Soviet Union, each seeking greater autonomy or independence from Moscow's centralized control. The significance of this rise cannot be overstated, as it directly challenged the unity of the Soviet state, weakening its structural and ideological integrity at a time when it faced other internal and external pressures. A prominent example of this nationalism was the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, where movements for independence gained momentum in the late 1980s. These states, forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union during World War II, valued their distinct linguistic and cultural identities. Their peaceful protests and political activism culminated in the Baltic Way demonstration in 1989, where approximately 2 million people joined hands across the three states, symbolically demonstrating their desire for independence. Another significant instance was Ukraine's declaration of independence in 1991, after a decisive referendum. As one of the largest and most economically significant republics, Ukraine's departure further isolated Russia and precipitated the Soviet collapse. The support for these movements often finds roots in the view that repressed national cultures deserved self-determination and the right to form sovereign states. Supporters argue that the Soviet Union's oppressive policies towards ethnic minorities necessitated a response that restored cultural integrity. However, potential challenges and controversies surrounding the rise of nationalism include inter-ethnic conflicts and the economic instability resulting from fragmentation. Critics of nationalism caution against its ability to breed exclusionary policies which might foster ethnic tensions within newly independent nations. The rise of nationalism and independence movements influenced other aspects of the main topic by accelerating political reforms within the Soviet Union and prompting the decentralization of power, as exemplified by Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring. These movements showcased the inherent weaknesses of the Soviet system, undermining its legitimacy and hastening its demise. Ultimately, the assertion of national identities against the backdrop of a crumbling superpower marked a pivotal transition in international relations, redefining borders and political landscapes across Eastern Europe and Central Asia.